Call Hugo Maitland.
The case you're about to see is fictional. The procedure, however, is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public. His Honour George Morrison presides in the case of the Queen against Owen, in which Kevin Owen has pleaded not guilty to the charges of robbery and assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, and of being in possession of an offensive weapon.
You are Hugo Michael Maitland, and you live at 27A Highacre Flats, Highacre Estate, Fulchester.
Right.
Mr. Maitland, would you please tell the court what occurred on the evening of Saturday, November the 27th?
I was out in my car, doing a mobile.
Which is what, exactly?
It's a CB term, Citizen Band Radio. It means using the radio in your car as against your home 20.
Home 20?
Your base, sir. Where you live, it's called your 20. It's a derivation of the American 10 code. 10-1 poor signal, 10-2 strong signal, 10-3 cease transmission, 10-4 is...
Thank you, Mr. Maitland. If you could bear in mind that it's unlikely that the jury will be familiar with the American 10 code, or any other code come to that, it would be helpful.
About what time of night was this?
Just after midnight. I know it was midnight because I just had someone on the call channel asking for a 10:36. The time.
Go on.
Well, I was parked at these traffic lights.
And where was this?
Where Brooker Street joins the main drag of the high road. I saw this old girl run out into the road just ahead of me.
Right.
Carry on.
Well, she seemed panicked, frightened, you know. She stopped as if to take a breath. She kept casting about, looking over her shoulder. All of a sudden, she was off again. Then I saw this lad. He darted out into the road just behind her and followed her. He kept shouting at her. I couldn't hear exactly what, but he had this stick thing, like a club in his hand. All the time she was running away from him. Then he was onto her.
On to her?
Well, grabbing at her, you know, her handbag. He grabbed her handbag, and then he pushed her, you know, like this. Well, she fell to the ground. Then he was off.
And where was the handbag at this point?
Well, he had it, didn't he? Clutched his chest like a trophy.
And you saw all this quite clearly?
I saw everything. Everything. You see, they were standing in front of a shop window, the big furniture shop in the high road. It was all lit up.
And what did you do then?
Well, I drove to where the old girl was. She was just lying there on the pavement where he had left her. Lying there moaning. So I put out a 10:33.
In plain language, Mr. Maitland.
Oh, it's a 999 on the emergency channel. Police, ambulance and that.
Thank you, Mr. Maitland.
Mr. Maitland, it was raining on the night in question, was it not?
Dribbling, aye.
Sufficiently for you to have your windscreen wipers on?
Probably.
Well, was it or wasn't it?
Aye.
And when the old lady darted out into the street some distance ahead of you, how in fact did you see her?
How?
Through which window of your car?
But the windscreen.
And yet you feel quite confident in your opinion of what you saw, that she appeared frightened? In spite of the distance, the fact that it was dark, and that presumably your vision was impeded by both the rain and your windscreen
I know what
wipers.
I saw.
Now you say the lad followed her and grabbed at her handbag.
I did, yes.
Now what about this stick or club that he was carrying?
Well, what about it?
Well, did he use it?
No, he used his other hand, the free hand.
And how close were they by then?
20 yards.
Are you asking me, Mr. Maitland?
20 yards.
And were you still observing them through your windscreen?
I was, yes.
And was it still raining?
Yes.
Your car, Mr. Maitland, does it have an adequate demisting system?
Sorry?
Well, my car, for instance, if I've spent some time in it, particularly if it's been raining, I have to use a chamois leather to wipe the windscreen.
Well, I don't have that problem.
Tell me, it's usual, is it not, for CB operators to give themselves a name, a handle, I believe it's called, for use on the air?
Yes.
Your Honour, the witness has stated quite clearly what he saw. I fail to see how his interest in Citizen Band Radio or anything else is in any way relevant.
The witness has indeed stated what he thought he saw, Your Honour. I'm simply trying to establish the possible difference between that and what actually happened that night. And to do this, I have to provide the court with a little background information on this witness.
Yes, I'll allow the questions. Carry on, Mr. Corrin.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, Mr. Maitland, the business of these handles. Am I right in thinking that the choice of such nicknames is usually associated with someone's job, occupation, or the like?
Sometimes.
What is the name you use on CB radio?
Vigilante.
I beg your pardon?
Vigilante.
Vigilante. Is it not a fact, Mr. Maitland, that you once belonged to a vigilante organisation on the estate where you live?
There was a lot of hooligans in the estate. Vandals, muggers. And since the police were doing sod all about it...
Mr. Maitland.
Well, we just decided to look after ourselves, that's all.
And were the police in accord with these views?
Not as such.
No. Mr. Maitland, I suggested, in fact, the activities of your committee came into direct confrontation with the police due to complaints of harassment by tenants. In some cases, violent harassment.
We were just giving them a dose of their own medicine, and that's all.
All right. You say that after the lad ran off, you immediately drove over to the old woman who was lying on the pavement.
I did, yes.
Where you promptly put out a call for the police and an ambulance on your CB radio.
Right.
Then you put out another call, did you not?
Must answer the question, Mr. Maitland.
Yes.
Saying what?
I asked for assistance.
In what connection?
Well, to get him, the lad. I put out his description and asked all mobiles in the area to help me find him.
You didn't feel you could safely leave that in the hands of the police?
I was in hand, wasn't I?
All right, what did you do then?
Well, I went after him.
What, leaving the old lady, as you say, moaning in the street?
Help was on the way.
Nevertheless, you felt your priority was to go after the youth and not stay with her.
Well, that's the way I saw it, aye.
I suggest the way you saw the whole incident, Mr. Maitland, was impeded not simply by the rain and by the distance, but by your involvement with your vigilante activities and your somewhat doubtful ideas on individual militant action in the prevention of crime. Now, would you call that a fair comment?
You want to come down our way sometime? Sir, how would you like to live with broken windows and piss in the stairs and your woman too frightened to go out at night and your own children turn into savages? If you call that fair, how long would you want to sit in your backside doing
Maitland, this
nothing?
court does not wish to hear your opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Maitland.
No hurry, Constable.
At 12:09, we received a report. At 12:09, we received a report of an assault and robbery on the corner of Brooker Street and the High Road. We had a description of the assailant, and the supervising officer asked me to check out all adjoining streets. Accordingly, I then drove down Halford Road into Branston Gardens. I turned right into Westbury
It is
Park.
the events immediately prior to the arrest that you are interested in, Constable.
Yes, Your Honour. Sorry, Your Honour.
All right.
In Abraham Road, I saw the youth Kevin Owen sitting in a bus shelter. His description matched that of the assailant. I radioed this to the station, parked the car and approached him. As I approached him, he stood up. I asked him his name, but he backed away from me. Towards the back of the bus shelter, that is. I then asked him to tell me his name again, and he attempted to push by me. Well, I grappled with him in order to stop him, and a struggle took place. Eventually, I restrained him, placed him under arrest and cautioned him, after which he accompanied me to the police station without further incident.
So, when you first approached him in order to speak to him, his first reaction was to run off.
Yes, ma'am.
And as a result of this struggle, what injuries did you sustain?
Bruising, for the most part, on my arms. He also tore my uniform, tore the sleeve.
Did he have a weapon?
He did. He had a length of lead piping. It was on the bench beside him.
Did he have any comment to make about this?
He did. He said it was to protect himself, that he felt safer with it.
Did he say anything else?
Yes, ma'am. When I calmed him, I said we were making inquiries into an assault and robbery, and he said, I know, I guess that's what it was about.
Those were his words.
Yes, ma'am.
Did he say anything else?
He did. He said, will it be on the local news?
Local news?
Yes, Your Honour, the television news. He said it several times, sir, in the car and at the station. He asked if I ever watched it. He made several references to television programmes.
In what context?
Well, there was no context. He just kept coming out with them. He said, it isn't like this on Juliet Bravo, things like that.
But when you first brought up the subject of the robbery itself, his words were, I know, I guess that's what it was about.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Constable.
Prior to your arrest of Kevin Owen, how many other arrests had you made, Constable?
None.
Oh, so this was your first. You could say your debut.
If you like.
And yet when you saw the accused from your car and had his description confirmed over your car radio, you didn't feel the need to ask for assistance?
No, I didn't. Well, it wasn't my intention to arrest him on the spot, but
You
just
didn't
to
think-
ask him a few preliminary questions.
You didn't think the manner in which you approached him might have alarmed him in any way?
Only if he'd done something to be alarmed about.
Oh, come now. A policeman striding purposefully towards someone sitting alone in a bus shelter on a dark night? It's enough to alarm anybody, surely. Particularly if they'd had no interaction with the police before.
I approached him to ask him a few questions, that's all.
Well, would you concede then that a more experienced police officer might have handled it differently? Might have made his approach a little, shall we say, less intimidating, and therefore less threatening?
I didn't threaten him.
My client will maintain that you did, Constable, that the manner in which you approached him frightened him, and that when he stood up, you manhandled him to the back of the bus shelter, where you told him what happens to bleeding muggers like you.
I didn't say anything of the kind, and I didn't touch him.
Yet a struggle did take place.
Because he tried to make off.
Yes, I don't dispute that, Constable. You see, what I'm trying to establish is why.
Well, he knew why I was there, what I wanted, didn't he?
Just answer the questions, Constable. Don't ask them.
Didn't it strike you as odd that he should be there? That someone who has allegedly assaulted and robbed an old lady should then sit quietly in a bus shelter in an adjacent street and await arrest?
I assumed he was waiting for a bus.
What, to make his getaway, you mean? Presumably, it also didn't strike you as odd that he was wearing only a sweater and jeans. Hardly suitable clothing for somebody with robbery on his mind on a rainy night.
I didn't attach any importance to them.
But you did attach importance to this weapon, this length of lead piping.
Yes.
Tell me, did he at any point try to use it during the struggle of yours?
It was on the bench beside him. I imagine he'd forgotten about it.
And that didn't strike you as odd either, that he should have a weapon and make no attempt to use it?
Not particularly.
Now this handbag. I understand you later found it under a hedge in the same street as the bus shelter.
Yes.
And the contents?
Intact.
Nothing had been removed?
No.
What, not the purse, the pension book, checkbook?
No.
Well, may I ask what conclusion you drew from this fact?
That he panicked and threw it away.
But according to your statement, he was sitting calmly in a bus shelter. Now, does that sound like somebody in a state of panic? You see, I suggest to you, Constable, the only thing he was in a panic about was the old lady. Now, he made a remark about her later on at the station, did he not?
Yes.
I wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell us what it was.
He asked me how she was, and then said, I never meant to hurt her. Tell Mother I never meant to hurt her.
Thank you, Constable.
You are Mrs. Jean Avril Stone, a widow and a retired school teacher, and you live at number 20, Bounty Road, Fulchester.
Yes.
Mrs. Stone, would you please tell the court what happened to you on the night of November the 27th?
I went out to visit a cousin. She's ill, confined to bed, arthritis. I was walking home, I only live a short distance away, when I saw this youth following me.
How did you know he was following you?
Well, I didn't, not at first. I just heard him, heard his feet. And at first I thought I was imagining it. Then I crossed over the road, and so did he. I started to walk more quickly, and so did he. Then I decided I'd be better walking in the middle of the road. It was lighter there because of the street lamps, and I thought if a car came, I could get help.
And what road was this?
Brooker Street.
And then what happened?
He crossed over into the middle of the road behind me, right behind me.
And he was still following you?
Oh, yes. Yes, I could hear the slap of his feet on the ground, and his breathing. And I thought, if I could just get to the high road, I'd be all right. There'd be traffic there and people. And then suddenly he started shouting, calling out to me.
Saying what?
Well, I couldn't hear everything he said. I was panting. I had this pounding in my ears, the way you do when you run and you're not used to it. He might have said something else. I was just looking at the lights in the high road and thinking that once I got there, I'd be all right. There'd be people there, and I'd be all right.
And when you reached the high road?
It was deserted. So I started to run again. And then he was there, right there, behind me, tugging at my sleeve. And I remember I said to him, "Here, take it, have it if that's what you want. Only don't hurt me."
You meant the handbag?
Yes.
And what did he say?
Well, he had hold of my arm with his fingers, gripping it. And my handbag was in my other hand, and he snatched it. And then he gave this little cry, and he pushed me over.
And as a result of this push, you fell to the ground?
Yes.
And what injuries did you sustain?
I hit my head, and I broke 2 ribs where they caught the edge of the pavement. It's disturbed my balance, the doctors say. This knock to my head has something to do with the inner ear. I have to take pills.
Yes, I understand that there's no dispute over the injuries sustained by Mrs. Stone, Your Honour.
Very well.
Were you still conscious when you were on the ground, Mrs. Stone?
Oh, yes, quite conscious.
And can you remember what happened?
Yes. I could see his shoes just inches from my face. And I remember thinking they weren't shoes. They were slippers, carpet slippers. How odd it was to wear carpet slippers on a night like that. And then he ran off.
Thank you, Mrs. Stone.
Obviously a very disturbing experience for you, Mrs. Stone.
Yes.
And not the first of its kind that you've suffered, as I understand, in the sense that you've been the victim of a mugging before.
Your Honour, I cannot see that any previous assaults on Mrs. Stone can have any possible bearing in this case.
With your permission, Your Honour, I'd like to show that, in fact, it has a definite bearing on the case. In fact, the two are inextricably linked.
Yes, very well. But keep it brief, Mr. Corrie.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, this previous mugging, Mrs. Stone, when did it happen?
2 years ago.
I understand on that occasion you were followed also and attacked before your handbag was stolen.
Yes.
And is it true to say, Mrs. Stone, that since that time you've been too frightened to venture out of the house very much alone?
Yes.
So, presumably, when you heard these footsteps behind you, naturally you assumed that your worst fears were about to be realized.
Yes.
Now, in your own words, you say you were running. Well, surely, if the defendant had been out to harm you, he'd have simply caught up with you. It would have been easy enough, without drawing attention to himself by shouting.
Last time it was I who shouted. The first time, I mean. It was I who shouted for help. No one came. No one. They don't. Not in a town. No one wants to help. They only hear what they want to hear.
A point I was about to make myself, Mrs. Stone. Now you say your single thought was to get to the high road.
Yes.
Presumably because you thought it unlikely he would attack you in such a public place.
Yes.
And yet, in fact, that is precisely what you are asking us to believe he did.
It is what he did, isn't it?
But we've established that he had ample opportunity to make this alleged attack in Brooker Street, which is a quiet, poorly lit side street.
Is that a statement or a question?
It's an observation, Mrs. Stone, on which I would like you to comment.
I have no comment to make. I don't know how his mind works, do I?
How old are you, Mrs. Stone?
67.
The defendant is 17. He's young and he's fit. If he'd wanted to catch you up in that side street, what was there to stop him? All right, let's examine what actually occurred. You say he caught up with you in the high road and grabbed your arm.
Yes.
Now, did he say anything?
No.
You're sure about that?
Yes.
But you said something to him, did you not? You said, if this is what you want, take it, but don't hurt me, or words to that effect.
Yes.
And it's not unreasonable to assume that you accompanied these words with the gesture of actually giving him the bag.
Only because he was going to take it.
But supposing he wasn't? Supposing he was simply lost and was following you to ask directions, and that in your anxiety to get away from him, you lost your footing, you slipped on the wet pavement.
He pushed me, deliberately, like this.
But you see, Mrs. Stone, we've already established the fact that the defendant had a weapon. In fact, he was carrying 2 pounds of lead piping. Now, if he'd meant to harm you, why on earth didn't he use it? I mean, why just push you?
I imagine he'd have used it if he needed to.
Isn't it possible that he reached out in the way that you describe in order to prevent you from falling?
No, he pushed me.
Now, this little cry you say he uttered.
Yes?
Now, you've stated this was just before he knocked you over.
Yes.
Wasn't it, in fact, after you fell, Mrs. Stone, that he called out in concern?
He pushed me, quite deliberately. You could see it in his face.
Oh, you had a good look at his face, did you?
Oh, yes. In the light from the shop window. His features were quite distinct.
Now, this previous mugging, Mrs. Stone, this former mugging, your attacker came from behind, as I understand, striking you over the shoulder from behind.
Yes.
Yet this boy not only spoke to you, allowing you to hear his voice, but he allowed you to see his face as well.
I caught sight of his face. That's all I know. It's not something I'm likely to forget.
Well, then, how would you describe his face? The expression on it, I mean.
He was staring.
And if you could have seen your own face at that moment, supposing for 1 second you could, how do you imagine you looked to him?
Looked.
Yes, the expression on your face.
Frightened, I imagine.
Exactly. You see, I'm going to put it to you, Mrs. Stone, that you were both frightened. That the expression you saw on his face mirrored that of your own. That the defendant was frightened, or at least disconcerted, by your overt hostility towards him, and that you were frightened because of your previous experience with a mugger.
One does not like to be in any situation where you lose control.
You think your fear made you lose control?
I did not want my life to end ignominiously and alone in some back street. I am nearer the end of my life than the beginning. Death is no longer something that happens to someone else. If anything, I'm grateful to him.
Grateful?
Until that night, I was never sure which was worse, death or the fear of it. That night, he provided me with the answer.
The case of the Queen against Owen will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case you're about to see is fictional. The procedure, however, is legally accurate. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the general public. Kevin Owen is accused of robbery and assault, causing actual bodily harm to Mrs. Jean Stone while attempting to steal her handbag on the night of November the 27th in the Fulchester High Road. He's also accused of possessing an offensive weapon. We rejoin the case with Mr. Corrie opening for the defence. Kevin Owen is in the witness box.
Truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
You are Kevin Donald Owen, and you live at 19, excuse me, 19 Ambrose Street, Fulchester? Would you answer the question, please?
Yeah,
And will you tell the court your age, please?
17.
Have you ever been in trouble with the police before?
No.
Your Honour, in order to explain the defendant's behaviour on that night, I want to provide the court with some information relating to the circumstances regarding his home life. The substance of his case depends absolutely on my being allowed to do this.
Your Honour, we can all claim to have less than happy home lives. I cannot see that it makes for a defence, or an excuse, come to that, for the charges the defendant is facing.
I go back to my original point, Your Honour. I'm not disputing that the defendant's behaviour that night needs explanation, which is not at all the same thing as an excuse. But how can I convincingly provide any explanation without first pointing to its cause?
Bearing in mind the defendant's age, Mrs. Hunter, it does seem a reasonable point. But don't stray too far off the point, Mr. Corrie.
I'll see that we don't. Thank you, Your Honour. You are an only child, are you not, Mr. Owen? Mr. Owen, you have no brothers or sisters?
No.
And prior to the night of the 27th of November, you lived at home.
Yeah.
Have you always lived at home with your parents?
Yeah.
And how would you describe your relationship with them as close?
Yeah.
Now then, tell me about school. What schools have you attended?
I haven't.
He doesn't mean any school you're attending now. He means in the past.
I know what he means. I already told him.
Yes, but I'm asking you again, you see, so that you can tell the court. And when you say you haven't attended school, as His Honour says, I don't mean sixth form, for instance. I mean school generally. Infants, primary, secondary.
Not them either.
Are you telling us you've never been to school at all?
No. Yeah.
Who was responsible for your education?
My mother. And Dad. Mostly Mother.
Did your mother explain to you why you didn't go to school?
She said I was better off without it. Better off at home.
Did you ever question that?
Sometimes.
What was her reply?
I was better off at home.
Is that all she said on the matter?
Yeah.
Now, in your recollection, do you ever remember anyone coming to the house from the education authorities to discuss this with your mother?
No. And people didn't come to the house. If they did, I'd go upstairs.
Why was that?
So that Mother could deal with them.
So, if there ever were any visitors, you didn't see them?
Only from the landing. I'd watch through the banisters until the coast was clear.
How do you mean till the coast was clear?
Well, then I'd go down again.
So, your mother made it plain to you that she didn't want you downstairs when she had visitors?
Just answer as best you can.
She didn't want them interfering.
Interfering with what?
Us. The family.
Well, that's the only explanation she gave you?
Yeah.
Now, apart from these infrequent visitors you were not allowed to meet, what other companions did you have, apart from your parents?
Eh?
Well, I'm talking about friends of your own age. Do you, in fact, have any friends of your own age?
No.
Do you, in fact, have any friends at all?
No.
Why is that?
Didn't want any.
Now, before the night we're talking about, how often did you go out of the house?
Now and then.
And where did you go?
My dad would take me for a drive Sundays. He takes me down the Chippy sometimes. I'd wait in the car for him. We'd go walking, too, on the Dales.
These excursions, these trips out, were they always with your father?
Yeah.
And apart from them, where did you go?
Different places. He took me fishing once, but Mother said no after that. I don't swim.
No, I mean, apart from these trips out with your father, where did you go?
I didn't.
So you never went out of the house alone?
No.
Why was that? Did you ever ask your mother why not?
Sometimes.
And what did she say?
She said I was better off at home, away from prying eyes.
Now, what did she mean by prying eyes?
She said people weren't kind. I was better off without them.
What did you think, Kevin, when you looked out of the window and saw people in the street? As a child, say, when you seeing children of your own age playing, going to school? How did you feel about that?
You must answer the questions put to you. Angry, sad, what?
Both.
When you told your mother how you felt, what did she say?
She said I wasn't like them, the other kids, so they wouldn't like me.
In what way were you supposed to be unlike them? I mean, how were you different from them?
Just different.
Do you watch a lot of television, Kevin?
I've got one in my room. A colour one, remote control. There's a hard one downstairs, but my picture's better.
Yes, I understand you like crime shows, police shows, Juliet Bravo, The Professionals, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, there was an episode of Juliet Bravo on that night, was there not? Do you know the night we're talking about?
Yeah.
Now, is that why you mentioned it to that police officer?
Yeah, except he doesn't watch it. He said real life isn't like that.
Did he? Now, let's get down to that night itself. You've already said that up until then, you hadn't been out of the house on your own before.
Yeah.
Now, what made you go out on your own that night?
We had words.
We?
Me and Mother.
What about?
About this music.
Yes, go on.
Across the road, there was this party. I could see people coming and going, all dressed up. The lights were on, and I could see them dancing. The shapes of them on the curtains when they were dancing.
Did you want to go to this party?
Yeah.
What did your mother say?
She said no. She said I hadn't been invited. I didn't know them. She said they wouldn't want to know me. I said they wouldn't notice me. I'd just stand in a corner and watch. But she said no.
But you decided to go anyway.
She locked the front door. It's got this lock on the inside with a key. Well, she locked it, put the key in her pocket, and said for me to stop going on about it. Her mind was made up.
And then what happened?
I went to my room. I could still hear the music and their voices.
What, from the party, you mean?
No. Mother and Father's downstairs shouting.
So what did you do?
I put the television on. And then I switched off the lights and I sat by the window so that I could see the party. Well, after a bit, Dad went out. He got into the car and drove off. Well, he often does that after a fight. So I switched the television off. The house was quite quiet. Then I got into bed and I pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes like I was asleep. Well, she came in and stood by the bed, and then she kissed me goodnight like she always does. Then she left.
Go on.
Well, I waited till I could hear her bedroom door close. Her room's next door to mine. Dad's is at the end of the passage. Then I started counting. I could still hear the music from the party sort of thumping, and I counted in time with it. Well, when I got to 1,000, I got out of bed and went to the window. Well, I got myself onto this little roof and worked myself to the edge till I was hanging on it. There's been this film on the television where someone did that. Well, then I let go and landed all this junk in the front garden. I thought my legs were broken. Well, then I heard Dad's car. Well, it's got this engine noise. You can spot even at the end of the road. You see, it's a Volkswagen. Well, I stood up to see if I could get my legs working. And then Dad parked his car and went to the house. I could hear his keys jangling. Well, then I heard the bolt, and I knew I was for it. I couldn't get back inside.
So what did you do next?
Well, it didn't seem such a good idea about the party, in case Mother found out I was gone and went there looking for me.
So where did you go instead?
Don't remember.
Try it for us, Kevin, will you?
Thought if I could find somewhere to spend the night, I could get back in the morning. Well, Dad's always up first, and I knew he'd have to unbolt the door to fetch in the milk. I could dodge back in then and get to my room without Mother knowing.
So what did you do?
I took a bit of piping from the pile of junk.
Why did you do that?
Well, it was late. Dark. I felt safer with it.
I see. So when you found yourself locked out, where did you decide to go?
A bus shelter. I'd remember seeing one when I was out with Dad. Well, I kept on walking, but I couldn't find it. All the roads looked the same, all these houses, with the lights on upstairs and closed curtains, and no one around to ask. Until her.
Now, when you saw Mrs. Stone, what did you do?
She was just up ahead of me. I called out to her, but she didn't seem to hear. She just crossed the street, so I went after her.
And when did you actually catch up with her?
In this big main road. Well, I thought maybe she was deaf, being old, so I caught hold of her sleeve. Just to speak to her, just to ask where the bus shelter was. But she hit me.
With her fist?
No, her bag. She hit me with it on the chest.
So what did you do?
Well, I tried to take it from her to stop her doing it again.
And then what?
Well, she tried to pull away from me and sort of keeled over.
You didn't push her? You didn't push her?
No, she just fell backwards.
Now, you're quite sure, Kevin, that you didn't push her, causing her to fall?
No, I just wanted to stop her hitting me with her bag.
Tell us what happened then.
She was on the ground, and I was standing over her. And then these lights came on.
What lights were these?
Car lights, headlamps, pointing at me, coming towards me. So I ran.
Why did you run? Kevin, if what you tell us is true, why did you run away?
I thought there'd be trouble. Mother would have found out, wouldn't she?
Now, since it was your mother's idea that you shouldn't attend school, do you perhaps resent her for it?
No.
But you do admit feeling angry and sad as a child when you saw other children going to school and so on. Well, either you did mind or you didn't. I mean, it would be rather odd if you didn't mind, wouldn't it, the picture we've had of a solitary child virtually imprisoned at home? You must feel something about that, surely.
I wasn't imprisoned. I could come and go as I pleased.
But you didn't, did you? At least not without one of your parents.
I didn't want to go out. I enjoyed my own company. What's wrong with that?
Now, let's talk about these lessons your mother gave you. What did they consist of?
Reading and stuff?
So you can read and write?
Sure I can.
And you did these lessons when?
Every morning.
What about weekends?
Sometimes.
Holidays? Christmas holidays? Easter?
We just went straight through.
Didn't you mind that? I must ask that the defendant answer the question, Your Honour.
Just answer yes or no.
Sometimes.
Or sometime.
Now, isn't it a fact that this hostility sometimes spilled over into arguments with your mother?
Sometimes.
Isn't it a fact that you once attacked your mother? Physically attacked her? You threw a telephone directory at her, hitting her in the eye, for which she had to have hospital treatment.
It was an accident.
Your Honour, I really must object to this line of questioning.
I'm afraid, Mr. Corrie, since you yourself opened up the whole question of the defendant's home life, the prosecution must be allowed to develop it.
Thank you, Your Honour. Now, how many times have you and your family moved house in the past, say, 10 years?
A few times.
Approximately how many?
4, 5.
Why was that?
No special reason.
Didn't it strike you as odd?
No.
Didn't your parents continually move because of your rows? As a result of which your mother was terrified a neighbour might complain, which might have resulted in the involvement of the education authorities.
No, we moved because we wanted to. Anyway, it wasn't me who started all the rows.
I'm not suggesting that it was. But since my learned friend has opened this up, we might as well get to the truth of it. And the truth I suggest is that you and your mother shared a violent and volatile relationship. from which it would not be unreasonable to assume you were determined to escape. Am I right?
What?
At 17, at a time when most young men are about to leave home and be independent, are you asking us to believe that you were happy to continue living in such an acrimonious and hostile atmosphere?
I had nowhere else to go, did I?
Oh, so the thought had occurred to you to leave?
No.
Well, if that was the case, presumably only because the practicalities stopped you. The lack of anywhere else to go, and more importantly, the lack of money.
Yes.
Now, let's move on to the subject of television. You say you watched a good deal of it.
Yeah.
I imagine, if nothing else, because it gave you an idea of the outside world, with which you'd had so little contact.
I just liked watching it.
And when you say a good deal, what does that mean exactly? You've told us that you sometimes watched in the afternoon. Did you also watch in the evenings as well?
Yeah?
Well, on average, that could be up to 8 hours a day. Some people would think that excessive. Now, you said, when you were on the roof outside your bedroom, you'd seen someone do it in a television film.
So?
Did that give you the idea to escape over the roof in the first place?
I didn't stop to think about it.
According to your evidence, you did. You specifically said that you saw a television film where a similar thing occurred. Now, the evening before the 27th, the evening before the alleged assault, did you also watch television?
Probably.
Did you, or didn't you?
Yeah.
Now, do you remember seeing a local news report concerning a mugging case in a Manchester street? It was shown on both major networks. Well, I'll refresh your memory. In the hope of locating witnesses, it reenacted a mugging in a Manchester street. In this case, an old man who was followed by a youth with a stick who attacked and robbed him. You've already stated a preference for television programs connected with crime, and that you were watching television that night. How could you have missed it?
I didn't miss it. That's why I took the piping. I was afraid the same thing might happen to me.
Well, let's turn to the night itself. You say you wanted to go to a party, but your mother prevented you.
Yeah.
And you quite calmly accepted this and went up to your room.
She'd locked the front door.
So you decided to wait until she'd gone to bed and go out by the window.
Yes. No. It just happened that way.
I suggest you planned it to happen that way.
Some plan. I'm not that stupid.
And neither is this jury. Do you really expect us to believe all this nonsense about a bus shelter?
It's the truth.
I suggest that the truth is, when you found yourself locked out of your house that night, you realized it was your chance to get away, didn't you? But you had nowhere to go, and more importantly, no money. But you remembered that news item, didn't you? And you knew your problems could be solved. And that's the real reason you took that bit of lead with you, wasn't it?
No, I said why.
Because if you could just get some money, you could get a bed for the night. Not to mention food and clothing.
I didn't need food or clothes. I was going back in the morning.
But after all these rows we've heard about, I suggest that you deliberately followed Mrs. Stone with the express intention of assaulting her in order to steal her handbag. Isn't that really what happened?
I said what happened. I said what happened.
No more questions, Your Honour.
I swear by Almighty God, the evidence I give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Mrs. Catherine Angela Owen, and you live at 19 Ambrose Street, Fulchester?
Yes,
Would you tell us, please, your relationship with the defendant?
I'm his mother.
Now, perhaps you could start off by telling us something about the defendant.
What is it you want to know?
Well, how you get on together, for instance.
He's my son.
So parents don't always have good relationships with their offspring, do they?
I can only speak for myself.
Well, then, would you describe your relationship as being close?
Yes, very.
And Kevin himself, how would you describe him?
Honest, kind, gentle.
Yes, we've heard evidence that might suggest the contrary, Mrs. Owen, that you used to argue quite frequently.
Arguments are not uncommon in any family, are they?
Is it true that during one of these arguments, Kevin threw a telephone directory at you, injuring your eye?
Well, that was an accident. A silly accident. He's at that age, isn't he? All children at this age rebel against their parents, rebel against discipline. It's perfectly natural.
So, all in all, his behaviour has given you no great cause for concern on that score. You regarded it simply as that of a typical teenager.
Yes.
Did he ever, perhaps in a temper, ever express a wish to leave home? Permanently, I mean.
Why should he?
He never once said or indicated that this might have been on his mind?
Never.
Did Kevin ever show any resentment over the fact that you opted to educate him at home?
I should warn you, Mrs. Owen, that you do not have to answer that question if you feel it might incriminate you to do so.
I don't mind answering the question. Children who do go to school complain about it occasionally, don't they? Of course he complained sometimes. I'd have been surprised if he hadn't.
But not sufficiently for it to amount to hostility between you?
No, certainly not.
Thank you, Mrs. Owen.
You say you opted not to have Kevin educated at school. Why?
You've had him up here, talked to him.
That hardly answers my question, Mrs. Owen.
I decided it wouldn't be in his best interest. As his mother, I consider I have that right.
Even though you were breaking the law in exercising that so-called right?
I did what I thought was best. And what has the law got to do with what is best for one's own child?
But what we have to ascertain is why. The basis on which you made this extraordinary decision.
He wouldn't benefit from it, would he?
Why not? Mrs. Owen, why wouldn't he benefit from an education like any other child?
Because he's not like any other child.
In what way is he so unlike other children? Other people of his own age?
He's retarded, isn't he?
The case of the Queen against Owen will be concluded tomorrow in the Crown Court. The case you're about to see is fictional. The procedure, however, is authentic. The characters are played by actors, but the jury is selected from members of the public. Kevin Owen is charged with assault, causing actual bodily harm, robbery, and possessing an offensive weapon. His mother is now being cross-examined by the prosecution.
Mrs. Owen, you stated that your son, the defendant, is retarded.
Yes.
Is that opinion based on a medical diagnosis?
If you mean a doctor, he hasn't needed one, not for years.
But someone must have diagnosed his condition in the first place.
There was a problem at his birth. I went into labor prematurely. The cord was round his neck. He had difficulty breathing. Later, when he was a few months old, he wasn't progressing as other children. He wasn't smiling or holding his head up. Naturally, I was worried. I took him to my doctor, who referred me to the local hospital. They said it might all be connected with the birth, lack of oxygen, that I might have to reconcile myself to the possibility that there might be brain damage.
And did they subsequently confirm this diagnosis?
No,
They didn't run tests?
I didn't go back.
I didn't need their diagnosis confirmed. I'm his mother. I could see how he was for myself.
Well, even assuming you were right, surely you wanted him to get help, receive treatment.
I've seen the kind of treatment the mentally handicapped get.
Do you mind explaining that?
My sister, my youngest sister, is retarded. I grew up seeing how people treated her. I didn't want that for Kevin. If it was something in me, something genetic, it was my responsibility to look after him, to shield him from that.
So you didn't go along with the theory that it was due to an accident at birth?
Accident at birth, genetic accident. What does it matter? I could see how he was, and I knew what had to be done for him.
You mean by locking him away from prying eyes?
I mean love.
With respect, Mrs. Owen, love doesn't solve everything.
That's easy to say when you've never been deprived of it. I grew up seeing all my mother's love diverted to someone else.
Your sister, you mean?
Yes. I didn't resent it. I understood. Naturally, it made me unhappy, but then, when I had Kevin, I realized it was all a preparation. There is, after all, a point to pain. By devoting myself to him, I could make sure he felt none.
Didn't it occur to you that his progress might have been swifter if he'd gone to school, mixed with people, other children?
And watched him struggling to keep up, struggling to keep pace.
Well, what about a special school that could cater for his needs?
No.
Why not?
Because I could give him everything he needed. Everything.
And you explained to him, did you, when the subject of education came up between you?
In terms he would understand, yes.
And did he understand?
Yes.
I suggest that he didn't, Mrs. Owen. I suggest that he was in a great deal of conflict over this. He loved you. You were his mother. He knew that you needed him. Yet he was also growing up and wanted to experience life. Except that this mother's love you talked of wouldn't let you recognize it.
Mrs. Hunter, this witness is not an expert in psychosociology.
What can you know about mother love?
Many of us have children, Mrs. Owen. And we all have to face the fact that there comes a time when you have to let them go.
I've already said any conflict there was between us is simply because of his age.
So you do acknowledge that he's normal, that he conforms to the average pattern of a teenager?
Anyone, whatever their mental age, is capable of anger.
So you concede he got angry?
Occasionally, of course.
And did this anger sometimes spill over into violence?
No.
You see, I suggest that Kevin is not as slow as you would have us believe. That the events of the night of November the 27th were entirely in keeping with his behavior in the past few years, and that he knew perfectly well what he was doing, which was to get money in order to leave a home which he found increasingly oppressive and suffocating.
No.
Would you say he was obsessed by television?
He enjoys watching it, if that's what you mean.
To the point that he did very little else?
It's a harmless enough activity, I would have thought.
Is it? I put it to you that due to the circumstances of his home life, the characters and events he saw on television were virtually the only outside contact that he had, and therefore had a fundamental influence on his behavior. As the person closest to him, wouldn't you confirm this? Well, let me put it another way. In your experience, did Kevin ever try to emulate anything he saw on the television?
What child doesn't?
We're not speaking about a child, Mrs. Owen. We're speaking about a young man who is very near to voting age.
Age is not something that is simply measured in years.
For the purposes of this court, Mrs. Owen, I'm afraid that it is.
Mr. Owen, we've heard that Kevin and his mother often rowed, and that once or twice these are alleged to have erupted into violence. Now, were you ever present during any of these occasions?
I certainly wouldn't say violent.
Well, how would you describe them then?
Well, people tend to lash out, don't they, in Iran?
But they were never of a serious nature.
No, no.
Now, how about Kevin's nature? How would you describe that?
He's affectionate and a little on the timid side.
Timid?
Quiet, introverted.
You see, we've heard that your family often moved house, and it's been suggested that it was because of Kevin's behaviour, because of the rows he caused and the complaints from neighbours. Now, is there any truth in that?
None. We moved because of my job. I'm a salesman. You get transferred a lot in my line.
Would you describe your family as being a happy one?
In the circumstances.
Presumably you mean the circumstances of Kevin's condition. Mrs. Owen has already told us something of her theories concerning that matter.
Yes, I mean that.
Now then, knowing Kevin as you do you believe he is capable of attacking and assaulting an old lady in order to steal from her?
No.
How about lying? Has he ever lied? To get himself out of trouble, perhaps?
No, he doesn't even know what a lie is. It's painful to see it sometimes, that kind of honesty. You wonder how someone so transparent could possibly survive.
Now, on the night of the 27th of November, Mr. Owen, did you and Mrs. Owen have a row?
Yes?
About what?
Well, Kevin got it in his head to go to this party over the road. People were coming and going as they pleased, and I didn't see the harm in it. He'd never been to one, you see. I thought it was about time he did. I thought it was about time a few changes were made.
And prior to that night, had he ever attempted to leave home before?
No.
Had he ever said he wanted to leave home before, to live somewhere else, perhaps?
Never?
Not even in anger?
You don't understand, you see, he and his mother, well, they're like a married couple. I joke about it sometimes. They couldn't manage without each other.
Now, the defendant has said that he saw a bus shelter on an outing with you. Do you remember any mention of that?
Yeah, we passed it once. It's quite near us. There was a young couple in it, you know, kissing, and it made an impression on Kevin. He said it looked like a little house, and he'd like to live there with someone to share it.
So it wouldn't be unnatural for him to attempt to find it once he found he'd been locked out for the night?
No, that would be just like him.
On the subject of television now, would you say it's influenced his behaviour at all?
Not especially.
He's never tried to copy the behaviour of characters on television?
He does a very good impression of David Bellamy.
As I was thinking more of crime programmes.
Well, he enjoys programs like that, but so do millions of other people. They don't go around robbing banks and mugging old ladies. Why should my son be any different?
Thank you, Mr. Owen.
But the fact is, Mr. Owen, your son is different, isn't he? Well, according to your wife's testimony, he is. This diagnosis she made concerning him, did you agree with it?
Up to a point.
And what is that point, exactly?
Well, when he was a baby, wherever we went, to a friend's house or to the park, babies were doing things he wasn't. I mean, children even younger than him, walking, talking and so on. We used to lie awake at night worrying. My wife's younger sister, she's Mongol, Down syndrome they call it now. Of course, we knew Kevin wasn't like that, but the thought of it was always there. Even when she was pregnant, the thought of it was there. She said it would be our punishment.
Punishment?
Oh, I didn't mean that exactly.
Well, what did you mean?
My wife and I, we were very happy when we were first married. Happiness like that, affection like that, she was unused to. It made her uneasy. She always said she would have to pay for it one day.
It's rather a bleak view of life, wasn't it?
Well, that's the way she saw things, sees things.
So the defendant, or rather your wife's diagnosis of him, was supposed to balance things. Is that what you're really asking us to believe?
Yes, it's not logical. I know I tried to tell her that. But my wife doesn't operate on logic. She trusts more to her emotions, and there's nothing like a child to bring out emotion.
So you didn't consider this diagnosis of Kevin in the same light?
Well, I know these things happen. I mean, when you have children, it's like a lottery. You can't always guarantee what you'll get.
You said you only agreed with your wife's diagnosis up to a point. At what point did you start to doubt it?
Well, I remember taking Kevin to a playground when he was small. There were other families there with this toddler, and this toddler, he stood there dribbling and looking around as if he didn't know where he was, like young children do. And the parents laughed. But when you've been given cause to doubt your child in that way, you look at things very differently. You can't just laugh and shrug it off.
With respect, Mr. Owen, you haven't answered my question. At what point did you start to doubt the accuracy of your wife's diagnosis concerning the defendant?
My contact with Kevin wasn't all that it should have been. My work took me away from home a lot. And I remember when he was about 8, I was in Manchester on a job, and I was parked near this playground, waiting for a client, and there was 2 lads playing around. And they were about Kevin's age, more or less, and they reminded me of him. I realized then that he could have been out playing like them, and there was no difference.
So you don't now consider your son to be different at all?
Only in that we have made him so.
Did you ever confront your wife with this?
Yes, but I'd left it too late.
In what respect?
She wanted a baby. I wanted a son.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
She had built her life around the fact that she had a child who would probably never grow up. When children grow up, they leave home, don't they?
Now, you say your contact with your son wasn't all it should have been. Was that only because your work took you away so much?
No.
The fact is, Mr. Owen, you have been, at least partially, living with another woman for the past 10 years.
Yes?
Now, in your opinion, how did Kevin, as he got older, respond to your wife's treatment of him, this continually treating him as a child?
He seemed to accept it.
Seemed?
Well, sometimes he got a little restless.
And did this cause rows?
If they were rows, they came from me.
From you?
Yes, she had to be told. See what she was doing to him. It was up to me to tell her. But it was too little, too late.
Why do you keep saying it was too late, Mr. Owen?
Well, it suited me, her belief about Kevin. He filled the gap I'd left in her life. People say a family is unhappy where there's no love. An excess of it can have the same effect.
Your name is Carla Elizabeth Wright, and you're a psychiatrist in the psychiatric department of Fulchester General Hospital.
I am.
Will you tell us, please, how you came to know the defendant?
The social worker handling his case at the remand centre asked me to see Kevin in order to make a clinical assessment of him.
And how many times did you see him in all?
We had 4 one-hour sessions.
Were you able to make an assessment after that time?
I was able to come to some conclusions, yes.
Would you be kind enough to tell us what they were, please?
Kevin is cross-lateral, a condition sometimes confused with dyslexia.
What does being cross-lateral mean?
Well, at its simplest, it's where neither side of the brain is dominant. If you're left-handed, the right-hand side of the brain is dominant, and vice versa. In Kevin's case, it's equal. This has given him certain motor and coordination problems, also a difficulty with reading, which he tends to see in mirror writing. However, it's got nothing to do with his overall intelligence, which I'd place as above average.
Anything else?
His lack of contact with people has given him a lot of inhibitions, resulting in a somewhat awkward, abrupt manner. He has a tendency towards depression, but I found no evidence of any psychotic behavior. In fact, on the whole, I find him cooperative and responsive.
Would you define for us, in layman's terms, please, what you mean by psychotic?
A severe mental derangement involving the whole personality.
And you found no evidence of this during your sessions with the defendant?
No.
Now, we've heard stories about fits of violent temper. Can you shed any light on that?
Yes, that was something we touched on. In my view, such symptoms are quite in accord with the circumstances of his home life, the depression and so on.
Now, did he ever, during your interviews with him, indicate that he was anxious to leave home, to leave his mother?
On the contrary, he spoke of her almost continuously. He's almost entirely dependent on her.
Yes, now you say his manner can be abrupt. Could you elucidate?
Because he's inexperienced in dealing with people, he finds it rather hard to talk to them, initially. He tends to be rather brash, I suppose, curt.
Could this curtness be mistaken for aggression? Appear threatening to someone who didn't know him?
I imagine so.
Could you be more specific, Dr. Wright?
Without a more specific instance, no.
All right, then, let me give you a scenario of an old lady, frightened, out alone on the street at night, and the defendant addressed her, called out to her. Now, could his manner seem threatening then?
Very much so, I'd say.
How great an influence would you say that television has played in his life?
considerable influence, obviously.
Would you say sufficient influence to make him mimic people or events on television programs?
It might occur to him, but his lack of confidence would be an impediment, certainly outside the home. He's been brought up believing himself to be different. If he does have any ambitions, it would be to dispel that, to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. He has an acute fear of people staring at him.
You say the defendant has a tendency to depression.
Yes.
About what? What was he so depressed about, Dr. Wright?
The fact that he was lonely.
And did he blame anyone for this?
No, he barely recognized the cause himself.
But he was aware that he wasn't altogether happy.
He has a very low expectation of happiness. That seems to be something he got from his mother. He doesn't expect life to be something one enjoys, simply something one must get through. This gave him a negative outlook on life, which consequently contributed to his depression.
You used the word symptom in connection with his alleged outbursts of temper.
Did I?
What did that mean exactly?
Perhaps it was the wrong choice of word.
Well, if you tell us what the word means in layman's terms, perhaps we can decide whether it was appropriate or not.
It's obvious what it means, surely, an external sign indicating something is wrong.
So, if we assume that your choice of words was not inaccurate, what was wrong with him to give him these fits of temper?
Frustration at his situation, I imagine.
Thank you. Now, you say he's almost entirely dependent on his mother.
Yes.
Well, isn't that rather an unhealthy state of affairs for a young man of his age?
It's inevitable, I'd have thought, given the facts of his upbringing.
And don't the facts also suggest to you that he resented his deprivation and therefore sought of a way from escaping from it?
His relationship with his mother is very complex. If he does resent her, I doubt he's ever acknowledged it. These things are very painful, go very deep. He never spoke of wanting to leave home to me.
But actions sometimes speak louder than words, don't they?
Isn't that rather a cliché?
Oh, come now, Dr. Wright.
Isn't human behavior rather a cliché? Now, what is his attitude towards women, aside from his mother?
He's had virtually no contact with them.
And has this complex and obviously troubled relationship with his mother coloured his view of all women, perhaps? Made him regard them in rather an oppressive light?
It's not inconceivable.
You've also spoken of his intelligence, which you rate quite highly.
Yes.
Now, is he intelligent enough, in your estimation of him, to lie, if necessarily, quite ingeniously?
He's certainly intelligent enough to. Whether or not it would occur to him is another matter.
But the mental capacity is there, should he wish to.
As much as it is with anyone, yes.
Now, these sessions you had with him, would you place his intelligence high enough to let us say he would attempt to mislead you, give you a false impression of his character?
I'm a trained psychiatrist. I doubt he'd have succeeded.
But once again, you concede it's not impossible that he should try.
But why should he want to?
Well, to substantiate his story, for the events leading up to his attack on Mrs. Stone, to win your sympathy, and therefore ours.
My sympathy is not that easily won.
But in the end, we are talking about opinions, are we not? Your opinion of his character based on these intermittent sessions you had with him.
My professional opinion, yes.
Have you ever been wrong in a professional opinion concerning a patient?
I'm not infallible. Are you?
Dr. Wright.
Dr. Wright, we are talking about a boy who, in your own words, is above average intelligence and whose mother says he is retarded. You see, I believe when he came across Mrs. Stone that night, his attack on her was not simply to get her money, but a vicious attack on her as a woman who, like his mother, stood in the way of what he wanted.
Have you been reading Reader's Digest?
Dr. Wright, don't be impertinent. Members of the jury, the charges against the accused are those of robbery, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and possessing an offensive weapon. Now, the prosecution case is that the defendant, in his anxiety to get away from an unhappy home life, deliberately attacked Mrs. Stone in order to steal her handbag from her, and that the attack and the robbery were not only deliberate, but maliciously premeditated. The defense admit that the events of the night in question need explanation, but they claim that they were due to the facts of his home life, that he never intended to attack Mrs. Stone, but simply to ask directions from her. They maintain that it was, in fact, Mrs. Stone's own fear of being mugged which precipitated the situation, and that she slipped and fell to the pavement. Now, there was a witness to the alleged attack on Mrs. Stone, and you must weigh his evidence up very carefully. Whether or not, as the prosecution claim, he was impartial and had a clear view of what he saw, or, as the defense claim, his view was handicapped firstly by the rain, and secondly by his opinion of the incident being coloured by prejudice. You must also remember that it is for the prosecution to prove the case. So you must therefore be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt of his guilt. It is not for the defendant to prove his innocence. Will you now retire, elect a foreman to speak for you, and consider your verdict?
On the first count in the indictment, that of robbery, do you find the defendant, Kevin Owen, guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
On the second count, of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
On the third count, of being in possession of an offensive weapon, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Kevin Donald Owen, it is unlawful to carry dangerous objects in public places. But as you have been acquitted of the charges of robbery and assault, I shall give you a conditional discharge for 2 years.
All stand.